Hi, I'm Dr. Russ, and this is Unit 1, What is Academic Writing? You've probably been doing different kinds of writing ever since you learned to read. You may have written stories and poetry when you were younger, maybe things like book reports when you were a little older. You may have written articles for a journalism class, or you may have done some term papers. In this class, we're going to learn about a new style of writing called academic writing. It's a very formal type of writing, and you will use it in year 4 when you work on your thesis or your final project. In this video, we are going to talk about the purpose of academic writing, the characteristics of academic writing, the academic writing process, and we will go over the instructions for the Unit 1 assignment. So the goal for this unit is you will be able to use your learning to discriminate, that is, tell the difference between academic writing and other styles of writing. So, what is academic writing? The purpose of academic writing is to communicate with anyone, anywhere who speaks your language. So, how do I do academic writing? Be clear, be concise. That is, say what you want to say in as few words as possible. When people's first language is not English, they have a hard time translating. So if you want them to understand you, you need to say it in very few words. Be unambiguous. Use words that everybody knows and that everybody agrees on their meaning. Be consistent. Use the same style that others in your field are using. And be specific. Say exactly what you mean so that people have no doubt about what you mean. And finally, support your claims, which means to prove what you say. Let's look at some examples. An example of being unclear is explicate and illustrate a canine. Those are very big words, and not everyone may understand what that means. So, how do we say that clearly? How about give an example of a dog? Being verbose means not being concise, using more words than you need to get the idea across. In this case, an example would be the user is given the option of invoking building lighting functions. What does that mean? There are so many words there, and they're written in passive voice. You're really not sure what they're saying. Now let's look at a concise example. Turn on the lights. So which would you rather have somebody say to you? Turn on the lights or something confusing like that where you don't know what they want? An example of being ambiguous is he got speed. Not everybody agrees on the meaning of speed. Speed means something completely different in Liberian English and American English. In American English, speed means going fast. So to be unambiguous, you would say, he can influence people. Another problem we need to avoid is being general. Motorcycles are dangerous. That's a very general statement. It makes you wonder, why are they dangerous? In what ways are they dangerous? An example of being specific is driving a motorcycle without a helmet is dangerous. Now we know at least what about it is dangerous. We want to avoid being vague. For example, people have been interested in this thing for a long time. The reader will go, what thing? How long? An example of being specific is, readers have been interested in this problem for at least 10 years. Now there's no question. We know that researchers are interested in a problem, and we know they've been interested in it for 10 years. Let's look at another example of being verbose. This could perhaps suggest that being concise is saying it in one word rather than three. This suggests that. Earlier, we mentioned supporting our claims. An example of an unsupported claim is in the bold blue below. Liberian food can be very spicy. The reader might think, how do you know? What evidence do you have? Why should I believe you? If you don't buttress a claim, that is, support it with evidence, all you have is an opinion. You don't have a fact. Now let's look at a claim that is supported with evidence. You see the same claim again in bold blue, followed by evidence in the plain black. Liberian food can be very spicy. Smith, 2008, ate 10 foods made with Liberian peppers and found that all of them burned her mouth. So now we know that Liberian food can be spicy because Smith researched it and provided data. And you gave me a reason to believe you. Now let's look at some things that academic writing is not. These things may be okay for everyday writing, like writing a note to your friend, but they are not okay for academic writing. What should I avoid? Being personal, being verbose, being flowery, stating opinions, and using slang. Let's look at some more examples. In academic writing, we must avoid being personal. That is, referring to the reader with words like you and yours. For example, as a teacher, you must treat your students fairly. We want to write in an impersonal way, not mentioning the reader. For example, as a teacher, one must treat one's students fairly, or teachers must treat their students fairly. We also need to avoid mentioning ourselves, except when necessary. Expressing just thoughts and opinions about things is one thing that we should avoid. So you should not have sentences with things like, in my opinion, I think that, or I like or dislike. Again, we aim for being impersonal. You can talk about what you did or what you're doing. I conducted interviews with. I argue that. I hope to achieve. Let's look at another example of being verbose. Interest in this phenomenon carried on in the year 2018. How can we say this with less words? An example of being brief is interest in this phenomenon continued in 2018. We use 2 words instead of 5. Another thing we want to do is to avoid being flowery. An example is, this horrible tragedy was obviously one of the worst catastrophes in construction history. That is very dramatic writing, almost like something you'd read in a newspaper. Again, we want to be very plain and say only what we mean and nothing more. The injury and mortality rates of this accident were among the highest in construction in history. Opinion has no place in academic writing. For example, Charles Dickens is the greatest writer of the Victorian period, and his influence on all subsequent literature is enormous. Okay, greatest, that's a judgment on your part. It's very difficult to prove whether somebody is the greatest or the least or things of that sort. Similarly, his influence on all literature written after his time, every single thing, statements like all or none or everyone or no one or always or never are called absolutes. And there are very few times when we can use absolutes in academic writing because they just can't be proven. What we want to have in academic writing are facts. Let's look at the same statement written as a fact. Charles Dickens is one of the best known writers of the Victorian period and has had a significant influence on the development of the English novel. Okay, best known is not some absolute. There are probably people that did not know Charles Dickens. So that one is a little less difficult to prove. The same thing is true for significant. We're not saying he influenced everything that came after him. We're saying he influenced a lot, but not all. And finally, we focus the statement a little on the English novel. Because with some research, we might be able to prove that. But when you say all literature, that means Chinese literature, African literature, which just may not be true. We should never use slang in academic writing. For example, using Liberian English, it got spoiled big. We need to use formal English because that's what's understood by everyone everywhere. It was broken beyond repair. Here's another example of slang, Southern US English. He went up the road a piece. That may not be understood in Liberia. In formal English, he traveled a short distance. So to summarize, let's look at the do's and do nots of academic writing. Do, be clear, be concise, that is brief, be unambiguous, be consistent, be specific, and support your claims. Do not be personal, be verbose, be flowery, state opinions, or use slang. Next, let's look at the academic writing process. There is a 5-stage process we can follow to do academic writing. And we are going to use this process all throughout this course. The 5 stages are pre-write, draft, revise, edit, and submit. In the pre-write stage, you will choose a topic, narrow the topic if you need to, write a thesis statement, search the literature to see what kind of information is out there for your paper, decide the structure or organization of your paper, and do further planning of the paper. In the draft stage, you will write the introduction, the body paragraphs, and the conclusion. The goal of the draft stage is simply to get the information in the paper. Then you revise the paper. You may do a peer review, which means asking a classmate to review your paper, or a self-review, in which you review the paper yourself. Then you will redraft the paper, which means adding, deleting, and rearranging the content, and revising the paper, which means changing the order of the sentences so that people can understand you better. Then you will edit the paper, which means fixing problems with grammar and spelling. Proofreading is making sure all the punctuation is there and that you're following the style rules for the paper. And also it involves checking for plagiarism, which means making sure that every time you've used somebody else's ideas in your paper, that you've given them proper credit. Then finally, you submit the paper to your instructor. Now let's look at this week's assignment. What we're going to do is evaluate 3 articles using the characteristics of academic writing and determine whether they are examples of academic writing. Then you will present the findings in a paper that models the characteristics of academic writing. Okay, that's fairly complicated. Let's break that down. So when you go to the assignment area, you will see 3 articles. Download each article and read it. Here's an example of what the articles look like. One is an article from Liberia Public Radio. One is an article from the Wikipedia, and one is an article from an academic journal. Using this video or the lecture notes, focus on the do's and do nots of academic writing. As you read each article, ask yourself, does the article look like academic writing? That is, think of what academic writing is, the do column. Or are there any clues that it is not academic writing? That is the do not column. Then you're going to write a 5-paragraph paper. And this follows the standard form that we almost always use in academic writing. There is an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. You should always have an introduction paragraph, at least one body paragraph, and a conclusion paragraph in academic writer, unless you're told not to. So in the introduction paragraph, we will state the topic of the paper, which is academic writing. We will tell the reader what you're going to do, which is analyze 3 articles. You'll tell the reader how you're going to do it. You're going to use the characteristics of academic writing to analyze each article. And then what will you do? You'll decide whether each article is an example of academic writing or not. Then you will write 3 body paragraphs, 1 paragraph for each article. You will answer the question, is the article an example of academic writing? That's your claim. Then you'll support your claim by answering the questions, why or why not, and how do you know? And you'll use those characteristics of academic writing to support your claim. And you may even quote parts of the article or describe what the author said. Finally, you'll write a conclusion paragraph that summarizes your paper and brings it to a close. You'll talk about what did you just do? What did you just learn? And what questions do you still have about academic writing? So here's how you will be evaluated. And you can see this information in your study guide and in the assignment itself. Your introduction must introduce the topic and explain what the paper will be about. The body paragraphs, which are your analysis, will state whether or not each article was an example of academic writing and gives concrete examples to justify the answer. And the conclusion summarizes the paper, describes what was learned, and presents questions for further consideration. Then there is a general criterion called scholarly writing, which means that you wrote clearly to support a central idea in an appropriate format, which we learned today, with correct grammar, usage, and mechanics. And finally, you will be evaluated as to whether the assignment has been submitted on time. If you submit the assignment by the due date, you'll get the maximum number of points. The later you submit the assignment, the more points you will lose. So you want to submit the assignment on time. So if you have any questions, ask your instructor or lab instructor.